There comes a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable at first, when you stop reaching out. No more long messages trying to explain yourself. No more rehearsing conversations in your head. No more bending your truth just to keep the peace. You don't announce it. You don't make a scene. You simply withdraw. And in that withdrawal, something profound begins to happen. For so long, your presence was constant. You were the one who showed up, who understood, who forgave, who gave the benefit of the doubt even when it cost you your own peace. You filled the silence before it could even form. You softened every edge, absorbed every tension, and carried the emotional weight of the connection as if it were your responsibility. And because of that, your presence became predictable, familiar, expected, but not always valued. You see, when someone becomes accustomed to your constant availability, they stop noticing the effort it takes for you to be there. They don't see the emotional labor, the restraint, the self-abandonment. They just experience the outcome, you being there, no matter what. And over time, what is always available begins to feel like it requires no appreciation until it's gone. Because when you step back, when you finally choose silence over explanation, distance over pursuit, your absence doesn't just create space. It creates awareness. The calls that no longer come, the messages that remain unsent, the emotional reassurance they once relied on without even realizing it, all of it begins to echo. And that echo is louder than anything you ever said while you were trying to be heard. This is the paradox. When you were present, you were overlooked. But in your absence, you become undeniable. And it's not because you've suddenly become more valuable. You were always valuable. It's because the noise you once filled is now exposed. The emotional safety you provided is no longer there to cushion them. The consistency you offered is no longer something they can lean on without consequence. And so, they begin to feel something unfamiliar lack. But here's where it gets important to understand. This shift is not about them suddenly seeing your worth in a deep, meaningful way. It's about them noticing the impact of losing access to you. There's a difference. One is rooted in genuine recognition. The other is rooted in discomfort, and yet, even that discomfort can feel validating if you're not careful. Because part of you might think, now they see me. Now they understand. But what's really happening is that your absence has disrupted a pattern they had grown comfortable with. You were a steady presence in their world, and now that presence is no longer guaranteed. So the question becomes, what do you do with that? Do you return to fill the silence again? Do you step back into the role that required you to shrink, to overgive, to overlook your own needs? Or do you stay where you are, grounded in the truth that your value was never dependent on their awareness of it? Because the real transformation isn't in them noticing your absence. It's in you no longer needing to be noticed to know your worth. And when you truly arrive at that place, your silence is no longer a strategy. It's a boundary. It's a declaration. It's the clearest expression of self-respect you've ever embodied. Your absence didn't make you valuable. It revealed that you always were, and as that absence begins to settle in, something else starts to shift beneath the surface. Something that has very little to do with love, and everything to do with control. Because in that dynamic, control was the invisible thread holding everything together. Not connection, not mutual understanding, but the quiet certainty that they could reach you, influence you, pull you back in whenever they needed to. And the moment you step out of that pattern, that certainty begins to crack. You're no longer responding the way you used to. You're not explaining yourself, not defending your boundaries, not rushing in to repair what they've broken. You're no longer predictable. And unpredictability, to someone who thrives on control, feels deeply unsettling. It creates a kind of emotional disorientation. They don't quite know where they stand with you anymore. And more importantly, they don't know how to get you back into a position where they feel in charge. So what happens next is often misunderstood. It can look like concern, like curiosity, even like care. They might reach out in subtle ways, checking in, testing the waters, saying just enough to see if you'll re-engage. And if you do, even slightly, they begin to regain their footing. The dynamic starts to rebuild itself, piece by piece, until you're once again in a position where your energy is being drawn out of you. But if you don't respond the way you used to, if you stay grounded, if you remain steady in your distance, then something else begins to emerge. You begin to feel a different kind of power. Not the kind that dominates or manipulates, but the kind that comes from no longer being emotionally entangled in someone else's instability. It's a quiet power. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't seek validation. It simply exists in the space where you once abandoned yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And this is where the real shift happens. Not in them, but in you. Because for so long, your sense of stability may have been tied to their reactions. If they were pleased, you felt safe. If they withdrew, you felt anxious. If they returned, you felt relief. Your emotional state was in many ways orbiting around their behavior. And now, as you begin to detach from that cycle, you start to reclaim something that was always yours. Your center. You begin to realize that you don't have to earn consistency. You don't have to negotiate for respect. You don't have to prove your worth in order to be treated with care. These are not rewards for good behavior. They are the baseline of any healthy connection. And once that understanding settles in deeply and honestly, something becomes very clear. The control they once had was never about their strength. It was about your willingness to stay in a dynamic that required you to diminish yourself so. When that willingness fades, the control fades with it. And yes, they may notice, they may feel the shift. They may even try to reassert that control in subtle or not so subtle ways. But the difference now is that you see it. You recognize the pattern, not as something personal, but as something predictable. And in that recognition, you are no longer pulled in the same way. You begin to respond rather than react. You begin to choose rather than comply. You begin to stand in your own experience, rather than constantly adjusting it to fit someone else's expectations. That's where your power is, not in changing them, not in getting them to finally understand, but in no longer needing them to, because the moment they lose control is the moment you stop handing it over. And in that moment, you don't just reclaim your voice, you reclaim your life. What often follows this loss of control is something quieter, but far more revealing. The pattern itself begins to lose its fuel, because for a long time, the dynamic was sustained not just by their behavior, but by your participation in it. Not consciously, not willingly in the way people usually think, but through something far more subtle. Your emotional investment, your attempts to repair, your capacity to forgive, explain, soften, and stay. That is what kept the cycle alive. You see, in many relational patterns that are deeply imbalanced, one person becomes the emotional regulator for the entire system. When tension rises, they smooth it over. When distance appears, they bridge it. When harm is caused, they interpret it in a way that makes it survivable. And over time, that role becomes so familiar that it starts to feel like love. But it is not love in its healthiest form. It is maintenance. Emotional maintenance of something that cannot sustain itself without your constant input. And so the withdrawal of that input changes everything. At first, it might feel like nothing is happening. There is silence, perhaps confusion, maybe even moments where you wonder if you overestimated your impact. But underneath that surface, the structure is shifting, because the system was never designed to function without your emotional labor. It was balanced artificially by your overextension. And when that overextension stops, the imbalance is exposed. What follows is often a kind of scrambling, not always obvious, not always direct. Sometimes it appears as sudden attention, unexpected warmth, or attempts to reestablish connection. But what is rarely seen in those moments is true reflection. It is not an awakening to your humanity or your worth. It is a response to the absence of something that once made the system comfortable for them. And this is where clarity becomes essential, because it is very easy, in this phase, to misinterpret attention as transformation, to assume that because someone notices your absence, they now understand your value. But value, in its deepest sense, is not recognized through loss alone. It is recognized through consistent respect, through emotional accountability, through the ability to see another person fully while they are present, not just when they are gone. What is happening here is something different. The cycle is attempting to restart itself. The same emotional patterns, the same roles, the same expectations, but with new urgency, because the stability they once took for granted has been disrupted. And yet, something in you is no longer available for that role. You no longer step in automatically to soothe discomfort that you did not create. You no longer interpret harm as misunderstanding just to preserve connection. You no longer abandon your own internal signals in order to maintain external peace. And in that refusal, the cycle loses its coherence. This is what it means to stop feeding it. Not through punishment, not through withdrawal as a tactic, but through the quiet recognition that your participation in something is optional, that your empathy is not an obligation to tolerate harm, that your presence is not a guarantee for someone else's emotional stability. And once that recognition takes root, something shifts in your nervous system as well. The urgency begins to dissolve. The need to fix, to explain, to re-enter the dynamic loses its grip. You start to feel something unfamiliar but deeply stabilizing, self-containment. A sense that you are no longer emotionally outsourcing your worth to the reactions of another person. At that point, the cycle cannot continue in the same way, because it requires participation from both sides to survive. And when one side steps out of the pattern, not in anger but in awareness, the structure collapses under its own weight. And what remains is clarity, not confusion, not longing, not negotiation. Just the quiet understanding that you are no longer willing to sustain what requires you to disappear in order for it to exist. And in that realization, the cycle ends. Not because they changed, but because you stopped sacrificing yourself to keep it alive. And as that cycle begins to lose its hold on you, something unexpected starts to emerge in its place. It is not loud. It does not announce itself with drama or confrontation. It is quieter than that. It is a form of dignity that begins to settle into your behavior, your decisions, your presence. A kind of self-respect that no longer needs to be negotiated with anyone else. At first, it may not even feel powerful. It may feel like distance, like hesitation, like restraint. You don't rush to explain yourself anymore. You don't overextend your time, your energy, your emotional availability just to maintain a connection that asks you to abandon yourself in the process. You begin to notice what you are saying yes to, and more importantly, what each yes is costing you. And this is where something profound happens, because self-respect is not a declaration. It is a pattern of choices. It is built in the moments where you would have once compromised yourself, but now choose not to. It is built when you feel the familiar pull to go back into old dynamics, and instead, you pause long enough to remember how it felt to lose yourself there. And over time, those small refusals accumulate into something visible. Not just to you, but to others as well. There is a shift in how you carry yourself. You no longer seek validation in the same way. You no longer adjust your truth to make it more acceptable to someone who benefits from your silence. You begin to occupy your own space more fully, even if it feels unfamiliar at first. Even if it feels uncomfortable to not be constantly available, constantly understandable, constantly forgiving. And here is where the paradox begins to show itself again, because the very thing that was once overlooked, your restraint, your patience, your willingness to understand, is suddenly noticed when it is no longer freely given. When you are no longer accessible in the same way, people begin to register your boundaries as something new, something unfamiliar. And in that unfamiliarity there is often fascination, sometimes resistance, sometimes even a kind of pursuit. But what they are responding to is not a change in your worth. It is a change in your availability. You are no longer easily accessed emotionally. You are no longer predictable in your self-abandonment. You are no longer someone who can be assumed to always stay, always explain, always soften the impact of someone else's behavior at the expense of your own well-being. And that changes the entire dynamic, because when self-respect becomes visible, it alters the emotional landscape around you. It sets a standard, not through words, but through embodiment. It communicates, without needing to say it, that your presence is no longer unconditional in environments where your absence from yourself is required. And for those who were accustomed to a version of you that constantly made room for imbalance, this new version can feel unfamiliar. Sometimes even unsettling, because it no longer confirms the old pattern where your needs were secondary to the comfort of others. But for you, something much more important is happening. You begin to realize that respect is not something you earn by enduring more than you should. It is something you claim by refusing to participate in what diminishes you. And in that refusal, you start to build a relationship with yourself that is no longer based on survival within unhealthy dynamics, but on alignment with your own emotional truth. There is a deep settling that begins to occur in this stage. Not perfection, not certainty, but alignment. A sense that you are no longer negotiating your worth in spaces that require you to shrink in order to belong. And that is where your presence becomes something entirely different. Not a source of overextension, not a source of emotional rescue, but a grounded, self-contained expression of someone who is no longer willing to abandon themselves for connection. And in that state, you are no longer asking to be valued. You are demonstrating, without apology, that you already are. And as that self-respect begins to take root, something else starts to unfold in the space between who you were and who you are becoming. There is a kind of transformation that doesn't announce itself as growth, at least not in the way people expect. It is quieter than that. It shows up in how you respond, or no longer respond to old patterns, in how you no longer rush to fill silence, in how you no longer confuse intensity with intimacy, because what begins to happen is this. Your change becomes visible, but not always understood. You are still the same person in essence, but your boundaries, your emotional availability, your willingness to participate in dynamics that once felt normal, all of that begins to shift. And to someone who was used to a more accessible version of you, this can feel like distance. Not because you are withholding anything, but because you are no longer overextending yourself to bridge gaps that were never yours to carry alone. And here is where perception becomes distorted. What is actually growth is often interpreted as rejection. What is actually healing is often interpreted as withdrawal. What is actually you coming back to yourself is often interpreted as you moving away from them. But that interpretation says more about their expectation than your evolution. Because when someone is accustomed to a version of you that constantly adapted, constantly explained, constantly softened yourself to maintain connection, any shift away from that pattern will feel like loss. Not loss of you in your wholeness, but loss of access to the version of you that was easier to engage with under the old rules of the dynamic. And so, they begin to respond to your growth as if it is something directed at them, as if your boundaries are a statement about their worth, as if your self-protection is an act of emotional distance rather than emotional maturity. But what they are encountering is not rejection, It is differentiation. You are no longer merging your emotional world with someone else's instability. You are no longer adjusting your internal reality to match external demands. You are no longer reshaping yourself in real time to keep a connection from breaking under the weight of its own imbalance. And that changes everything. Because people can adapt to consistency. They can even adapt to inconsistency. But what is deeply unsettling for many is the presence of someone who is no longer negotiable in their self-abandonment. Someone who no longer returns to old roles simply because those roles are familiar to others, and so they may attempt to reinterpret you, to revisit the dynamic, to reach for the version of you that once made things easier for them emotionally. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of disorientation, because when the pattern changes, the mind naturally tries to restore what it once understood as stable. But you are no longer that stability for them at the cost of your own instability. And this is where the internal shift becomes irreversible, because you begin to feel it. Not as a thought, but as a lived experience, that you cannot go back to being someone who disappears inside a relationship in order for it to function. You cannot unsee what you now understand about emotional reciprocity. You cannot unknow the cost of overextending yourself for the sake of maintaining a connection that required your self-abandonment to survive. And in that recognition, something stabilizes within you. You are no longer negotiating your growth to make others comfortable with it. You are no longer translating your healing into something more palatable. You are no longer returning to old versions of yourself just because someone else finds them easier to engage with. Instead, you begin to stand in a very different place. A place where your change is not up for debate. Where your evolution is not something to be reversed for the sake of familiarity. Where your distance from old patterns is not an act of punishment but an act of integrity. And in that space you realize something quietly powerful. You are not losing connection. You are losing confusion. And what remains is clarity strong enough to never require you to shrink again. And when that clarity finally settles in, something very important begins to reveal itself. Something that can easily be misunderstood if you are still viewing it through the lens of emotional longing or old attachment patterns. It is the moment when the other person begins to reappear. Sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, sometimes in ways that feel almost familiar enough to pull you back into old emotional reflexes. But what is actually happening here is not transformation. It is reaction, because when access to you changes, when your emotional availability is no longer guaranteed, when your responses are no longer immediate, when your energy is no longer something they can assume, something inside that dynamic gets disrupted. And disruption often creates movement, not necessarily growth, not necessarily insight, but movement. So they may come back. They may reach out. They may say things that sound reflective, even vulnerable at times. They may revisit memories, highlight connection, or express a sense of loss. And in those moments it can feel deeply compelling, especially if part of you remembers the emotional intensity of what once existed. But it is important to pause internally and ask a different question. Not what are they saying, but what has actually changed, because genuine recognition of value does not only appear in absence, it is demonstrated in presence. It is shown in consistency. It is revealed in how someone behaves when they still have access to you, not only when they are at risk of losing it. And this is where the distinction becomes crucial. What often returns is not necessarily a new understanding of who you are, but a renewed awareness of what they no longer have access to. And that difference matters deeply, because one is rooted in mutual recognition, and the other is rooted in emotional interruption. You begin to see that their return is not always an arrival. It is often a cycle trying to restart itself. The same emotional pattern, the same roles, the same expectations, only now with a new urgency attached to it. As if intensity could replace integrity, as if emotional expression in itself could substitute for emotional change. But you are no longer in the same position you were before. Something in you has shifted beyond the point of simple reversal. You have seen the pattern. You have felt the cost. You have experienced what it is like to abandon yourself in order to preserve connection, and you have also experienced what it is like to step out of that pattern and begin to return to yourself. And once you have felt both, you cannot unfeel the difference. So even when the return happens, even when the words sound familiar, even when the timing feels emotionally charged, there is now another layer of awareness present in you, a kind of grounded recognition that does not get swept away by emotional intensity alone. You begin to notice whether there is real accountability or just emotional expression, whether there is sustained change or just temporary re-engagement, whether there is a willingness to meet you differently or simply a desire to regain access to you as you once were. And in that noticing, your response begins to shift, not from anger, not from defensiveness, but from clarity, because you are no longer trying to decide whether you are valued. You are observing how value is demonstrated. You are no longer trying to earn recognition. You are evaluating consistency. You are no longer trying to restore what was lost. You are discerning whether what returns is actually different or simply familiar in a new disguise, and that is where your power becomes quiet but absolute. You do not rush to close the distance. You do not rush to reopen access. You do not confuse emotional intensity with emotional truth. Instead, you allow time to reveal what words alone cannot sustain, and in doing so, you step into a deeper form of self-respect. Not the kind that reacts, but the kind that observes. Not the kind that hopes, but the kind that knows, because at this stage, the most important realization is this: you are no longer evaluating whether they value you. You are finally evaluating whether you can continue to value yourself in the same place where you once had to disappear to be loved. And that changes everything. Because when you no longer abandon yourself to be chosen, you begin to realize you were never the one who needed to prove your worth in the first place. You were simply the one who finally stopped forgetting it.